Thank you very much. We'll end with talking about the frontal lobe of the brain. We'll actually be talking about the entire brain, but particularly this area of the brain. And this area is the analytical portion of our brain. Intelligence is our capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And that requires the entire brain, not just the frontal lobe, but also the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe. It's often measured by an IQ test. The IQ tests are accurate in about 85% of people. It greatly underestimates some people's intelligence and greatly overestimates others that are good test takers. But it is normally a fairly accurate depiction of our capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And obviously that can be related to academic performance and to your overall academic achievement. College graduates' first job after graduation has been found to be related to their IQ. However, how far they advance in that job is not at all related to their IQ. It's related to their EQ, their emotional intelligence. And a lot of smart people have come through our program that have emotional intelligence challenges, and they did get a good job out of college, and I'll ask them, you haven't really advanced for years now since you got this job, and they'll tell me how others have passed them over for promotion, and I'll ask them why they think that is, and normally they'll tell me it's because my boss isn't intelligent enough to recognize my intelligence, and that's why I'm being passed over. Well, the boss is recognizing intelligence, but it's the emotional intelligence part that's being recognized, and that can be the reason why it's passed over. There are advantages of higher intelligence. You're more efficient in studying. You can live a balanced lifestyle, even in a rigorous academic program or a rigorous work environment. You're more creative. That can have some significant benefits. You're more logical, you're more persuasive, your influence goes up, you're more likely to become wealthy. For many intelligent people, wealth is not even on their top 10 priority list, so you may not be wealthy at all, but certainly more likely to become wealthy. We'll talk about some of the reasons. But this was a study of 862 men and women. And I like these large studies that last a long time. You can see when the study started and when it ended there. The researchers found that up to the cutoff point of 163, now that's a very high IQ, average is 100, but up to the cutoff point of 163, participants' risk of dying during a given period decreased as their IQ increased. For example, those with a childhood IQ of 150 had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. And so IQ is associated with longevity. Harvard University wasn't sure why at that point, but they did mention that this is a significant advantage in regards to your overall longevity. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about the reasons why. We've now elucidated it. That study was in 2005, but we've now figured out why it is so tightly connected to longevity. So let's talk about some other lobes. The temporal lobe is where our music is heard. The temporal lobe has a lot to do with musical ability, but it also has a lot to do with memory. Your verbal and declarative memory is there, and your hippocampus, which is part of the temporal lobe. We have the occipital lobe, which is where our visual and spatial orientation is at. My wife, who's not an architect, she's a physical therapist, but architects have really appreciated her occipital lobe because she'll go into a building and see how walls can change and what can be changed and things like that, and has it all depicted there in her brain, natural ability there as far as the occipital lobe. Parietal lobe is where division, calculation, subtraction, multiplication tables, and even language. When we're learning a new language, we're getting our parietal lobe stimulated. And Einstein, when he gave his brain to science, he was found out to have a little larger parietal lobe. Cerebellum is where our coordination is centered. And when teams get on the field to compete, or tennis players, they're actually determining which person has the most developed cerebellum. They don't necessarily realize they're doing that, but for a team it would be the most corporate development of the cerebellum. This is where you can perform athleticism with grace. And then, of course, the frontal lobe, and this is where EQ and IQ come together. Emotional intelligence and general intelligence come together at the frontal lobe. This is all where our working memory is at. When I mentioned that, I think, on the first presentation. Our working memory as well as our ability to manage our emotions. This is a quote from Guyton's textbook of physiology. Scientific studies show the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and also the will. This is where we make good decisions, or if we're not making good decisions, it's due to our frontal lobe not working so well. And of course, there are other creatures that have brains and frontal lobes. One of those is a cat. Cat brain is not necessarily very big if you've ever dissected a cat like I had to do in high school biology, but what I didn't realize in high school was only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. What does that tell us? Not much morality in a cat. And I grew up with dogs. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe. 7% of their brain is in the frontal lobe, so that's pretty good for an animal. But I remember my neighbor friend a couple of doors down had a cat, and we were in there. I was playing with my neighbor boy, and then this cat caught this mouse, and it was just beyond my ability to grasp why this cat would torture this poor mouse. He would take a bite out of it and then watch it run and then grab it again and, you know, just torture this thing to death. And I thought dogs would put that cat out of its, or the mouse out of its misery, because it doesn't want to see that type of suffering going on. And so dogs, they might not hesitate to murder if they have to, but they do it much more mercifully. And of course, they do have more ability to empathize. I don't know if you've realized, but when you come home, your cat doesn't really care whether you're there or not, and as long as the cat has food. But the dog is able to, enjoy your company and be excited when you come home and have that empathy portion of things. By the way, there are sea creatures as well that have higher frontal lobes, and the dolphin is the sea creature that can have that empathy as well. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal species. 17% of their brain is in their frontal lobe. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe, and this is what gives us the ability to accomplish advanced planning and thinking. Gives us the ability to choose our own destiny and to even have complex steps in regards to a building and architecture and engineering and all of those wonderful things that humans can do and play a role in. But it's also what sets us into being spiritual beings. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but when there's a worship service being held, you don't see cats and dogs flocking to that worship service. They don't have that capacity, that frontal lobe capacity to worship. And so, but with the large frontal lobe of human beings, you have that capacity. So when the frontal lobe starts to go down, we see in individuals or in groups of people very predictable things that will happen. An impairment of moral principle occurs. So when you want to follow the decline of morality in a community or in a nation or in an individual, it's going to come down to the frontal lobe. Social impairment also occurs when the frontal lobe is compromised. It's natural to love family members, but when there's that natural love for family is gone. It's often due to frontal lobe compromise. Lack of foresight also occurs. Our ability to reason from cause to effect is a frontal lobe phenomena. And you can actually follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far he is planning in the future. If you tell a 4-year-old on Wednesday that something's going to happen on Saturday, he might be excited about it on Wednesday, but unless you remind him, he's not going to be able to think that far in advance. Where a second grader will know that next year I'm going to be going into the 3rd grade. They'll be able to digest that. And hopefully, as that brain grows and develops, the person is able to wisely choose their career and marriage partner as a result of that foresight. Abstract reasoning is impaired when the frontal lobe goes down. So our ability to interpret proverbs, to think on the abstract is impaired. Mathematical understanding is diminished. Now, I talked about calculation, division, subtraction not requiring the frontal lobe. That's the parietal lobe. But higher forms of math, calculus, higher forms of algebra, require the frontal lobe for understanding. Loss of empathy also occurs. And there's this saying that there's no way you can understand what she's going through unless you've walked in her shoes. That's actually a true statement only for those who don't have a good frontal lobe. There's no way they're going to understand unless the same things have happened to them under the same conditions. But studies show if you have a very good frontal lobe, you can just hear about what happened to her and you will feel precisely those same emotions. That's the empathy part of having a very good frontal lobe. Lack of restraint also occurs. So you have boasting, hostility, loss of temper, these things that are becoming more common in our society. I don't know how it is in Australia, although I'm guessing it's here because, a few years ago I was in Australia. And I noticed the irritability of drivers has gone up a little bit. Now, I know I'm partly at fault because I'm still getting used to driving on the left side of the road. But the number one reason for traffic fatalities in America is no longer accidents. It's actually road rage. And so people will get upset at what happened, and then they will begin a fight out there, and road rage can take your life. So this is, of course, due to serious lack of frontal lobe abilities in the drivers that are getting into this sort of thing. And then when the frontal lobe goes up, creativity goes up, ingenuity goes up. There's 2 essential components, being original and adaptive, making a positive contribution to the life of others. And you can see why enhanced frontal lobe can be connected with wealth, because if you come up with something that's completely original and helpful to a lot of people, and then put it into manufacturing and all that, you can go from the lowest socioeconomic status to the highest socioeconomic status in a matter of a few years. Interest will also go up when your frontal lobe is enhanced. It's fun to interact with someone who's intrigued by everything. And interest and frontal lobe function go together. And as this author stated, if curiosity can be cultivated, which it can by enhancing the frontal lobe, no one need search for interesting experiences. One will simply have them. And if we had someone with a very good frontal lobe here today and we sentence them to this room after the lecture was over with and say you couldn't leave until we tell you to leave, they might think they're being treated unfairly and all of that, but if they have a very good frontal lobe, by the time you went to get them 3 or 4 hours later, they'd be studying something in this room that would be very interesting to them. And they wouldn't be sure they'd actually want to leave because they were in the midst of studying that thing. It might be the piano mechanism up there, it might be some of the things down over there at the booth or whatever. But if curiosity be cultivated, no one need ever search for interesting experiences. And in today's world where we just have a bunch of copycats, the people that are searching YouTube, it doesn't improve their creativity at all. They're just going to be seeing what others have done in front of them. And so there's a lot of people in the younger generation that are fearful of being bored. Actually, being bored is a good thing because it increases your creativity. And so just like I mentioned, if you're sentenced to this room, a younger generation person would think that's kind of like the worst thing that ever happened to them, where a person with a very good frontal lobe wouldn't see it the same way. So there are drugs that impair the frontal lobe, illicit drugs. The illegal drugs, virtually all the recreational illegal drugs have one signature, and that is they suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. And even a lot of prescription drugs do this. This is why we always have to weigh the benefits versus the risks of using these drugs that cross the blood-brain barrier and will suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. Another thing that's been increasing in both Australia and in America is the use of pot. In a massive 4-decade study published in 2012 by the National Academy of Sciences titled Persistent Cannabis Users Show Neuropsychological Decline from Childhood to Midlife, followed more than 1,000 subjects from birth until age 38. Researchers' core finding, repeated marijuana use does what? It lowers your IQ, your ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge, and it lowers it permanently. But in addition to that, it also lowers emotional intelligence even more. It'll lower your motivation for just about anything. And one of the things it also causes is nihilism, and it also increases the risk of psychosis significantly. Marijuana is also somewhat of a psychedelic, and as such, it can dramatically increase the risk of psychosis if you're at risk for that condition. And by the way, psychosis is almost a fate worse than death in regards to your ability to be of use to anybody, et cetera. And so, you know, it really should never be considered being utilized in a recreational setting unless you've actually spent $600 and gotten a genetic test to see whether you might be at risk for psychosis. I think it should be mandatory for anyone selling marijuana to make sure someone has that $600 test there before they start giving them marijuana, but then all the profits go away. So that's not too cool for those that are manipulating and suppressing the frontal lobes of others at their own benefit. And so don't expect the government to mandate that. In fact, why has the government legalized marijuana? Is it because they think it's going to enhance humanity? No. They've legalized it because if they can make it legal, they can tax it. And so it's really for the money that they're after on this. Very short-sighted, by the way, because studies show the amount of police you need to hire goes up significantly. All sorts of expenses, government expenses, go up significantly. Welfare recipients go way up as well. Because if you're not motivated, you're not going to want to work. You're going to try to find reasons not to work and collect off of others, et cetera. But it is definitely a silent killer of emotional intelligence. And one of the most serious things it causes is nihilism. Have you heard of nihilism? Nihilism is where people think that it would actually be better for everyone to be annihilated. And so you've heard about these school shootings in America. One thing the media will not tell you about those school shootings is there's one substance on board for every mass shooter so far that they've been able to find and do blood tests on. What do you think it is? It's not alcohol. Alcohol's on maybe half of them, but it's marijuana. By the way, alcohol, we'll talk about it, alcohol suppresses the frontal lobe of the brain. And so you're much more likely to be violent, you're much more likely to utilize poor judgment, but alcohol does not cause nihilism. So the alcoholic is never killing people that they don't know and just shooting people up. But a marijuana user, because of the nihilism association, will think he's actually doing this whole school a favor by just wiping out all of these kids because they'd be better off dead. anyways. So that's the connection between nihilism and marijuana is very tight in regards to that. And marijuana users that come to our program will talk about their nihilistic activity that they've done, maybe not school shootings, but they've done other things in regards to even self aspects in regards to nihilism. So, legal drugs that impair. And by the way, a lot of people talk about the medical use of marijuana. Now, that's another thing. People will talk about CBD. CBD might be helpful for seizures, things like that. But you can't get CBD without the THC. They try to purify it out. They can't get rid of it all. And that's why if you're taking CBD products and you're having to take a urine drug screen to get a job at a certain place, then you're going to show up with THC, because that's how they do the test. They're not looking at cannabinoids. They're looking at the THC aspect of things. And THC is the one that does all of this, this bad stuff. And so it's actually very worthwhile to search for things that can do the benefits of CBD without the risks of THC. And we talked about one of those, Selexon, for instance, for anxiety. There's a whole host of products that aren't going to cause nihilism and psychosis and all of that. And so why do we continue as narrow-minded human beings to search for a type of marijuana that we might actually, be able to get the benefits and the risks? It's kind of an impossible task to do that. But humanity will narrow their mind on something that has benefits and risks and just totally focus in on that, where the 1,000 things that have benefits and no risk, they completely ignore. And that's something that I would encourage you to come to the 8-week seminar for, because you're going to find out about all those products that do have benefits, no risk, no worry about psychosis, lowering your emotional intelligence, your frontal lobe, and those sorts of things. So alcohol is one of those legal drugs that impair, and if you have alcohol on board, what is the legal limit of alcohol intoxication as far as driving in Australia? Does anyone know what it is? 0.5. Okay. So, or it would be 0.05. Is that right? Yeah, okay. So 0.05. Well, that's good that you're 0.05. And in California, it's 0.08. So you can have several drinks. As long as you're over 21, you're not allowed to have any alcohol on board prior to 21. But at 21, if you have a couple of drinks, chances are you're still going to be less than 0.08. And if a policeman pulls you over and you're less than 0.08, say like you're 0.07, will you be able to walk a straight line? You actually can. You can walk a straight line, and if you're skilled at doing so, they say the most difficult feat to accomplish in all of sports is to hit a curveball out of a baseball park. I know you guys don't play baseball here, maybe because it's too difficult. I'm just kidding. But you're seeing a ball come, 100 miles an hour from 60 feet away, and it's moving, and you're having to square up on that ball and hit it. And there's a baseball player in the United States who will have a couple of drinks before the game, and he'll still hit home runs. That's how good his cerebellum is working. It hasn't affected his cerebellum yet, but it has affected his frontal lobe. You don't need a frontal lobe to be able to do that. You're just following it with the cerebellum and with your physical aspect of things. But this guy has gotten into serious auto accidents on the way home from a baseball game. Why does he get into auto accidents when he can hit a baseball out of a baseball park? Anyone want to explain that? No? It has to do with his judgment and decision making. And this is what happened to Princess Di's driver. Since you guys are you guys, no, I guess you're not. You're not under the UK like Canada is. Oh, you still are under the UK. Okay, so maybe we should introduce you to the Declaration of Independence. But, but anyways, Princess Di's driver was walking straight lines. He was conversing normally, and no one recognized he was drunk. But he had alcohol on board, and he attempted to do a turn at a speed that was impossible to negotiate. The best race car driver in the world would not have been able to successfully negotiate that turn at that speed in that tunnel. And thus, he lost his life, the princess lost her life, others lost their life. Now, if alcohol was out of his system, and that's what was happening to this guy Cabrera as well, coming home from the game, he would attempt to do things with the automobile that couldn't be done. It wasn't that his coordination was off. In fact, studies show you're a little safer if your coordination goes off. You try to turn the wheel, oh, wait a minute, and so you slow down. And so these real drunk drivers, they're weaving, but they're going real slow because they realize their cerebellum is not there. Where the person who thinks they're just fine, this alcohol hasn't affected me at all, those are the ones who are the most dangerous drivers, and they're speeding around and they're trying to do things with the automobile that are kind of impossible to do, and they get themselves in major trouble. So if Princess Di's driver had not died and had not been seriously injured in that accident, and he didn't drink anymore, he would have been able to successfully negotiate the princess, even with paparazzi chasing him the next day. Why? Because his judgment would no longer be affected. But there's a difference between judgment and critical thinking. Critical thinking is something that you need when you're flying an airplane under instrument conditions, and one of those instruments goes bad. And this is what happened to Air France on the way from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, France a few years ago. It was at night, they were in clouds, couldn't see stars, couldn't see the moon, and one of their instruments went bad. And as a pilot, my son Justin is here today. He just turned 21, which means it's legal for him to drink, but he won't be drinking because of the critical thinking aspect that's extremely important. So these three pilots had all had something to drink, not in the last 24 hours, you can't drink in the last 24 hours to get it out of the system, but within the last 3 days. And so when their airspeed indicator went wrong, and the airspeed indicator indicated they were going too fast, and so the plane then slows itself down, and it slows itself down by pitching itself up, and now you're starting to lose altitude, 3,000 feet a minute, 4,000 feet a minute, and they're all trying to figure out what's wrong. How long did they have to figure it out? They were up over 30,000 feet, so they had 8 minutes to figure it out. They even woke up the most experienced pilot in the back. What's happening here? And he's looking at it. He can't figure it out. Critical thinking was gone. And it takes 30 days for critical thinking to come back once you've had alcohol on board. And that's why it's best to never drink alcohol. In fact, our FAA is very aware of this. They would like pilots to never drink alcohol, because if you're trying to solve a problem that you haven't specifically trained for, and they hadn't trained specifically, normally you train for the airspeed indicator going to 0. You know, if it's inoperative, normally it just goes to 0. They had trained for that. They would have been able to figure that out since they didn't have alcohol on board at that minute. But if you're having to try to solve something out of the box, a critical thinker is necessary to do that. And that's something that's even good to do, you know, even if you're a surgeon. The other day, my son, who's an orthopedic surgeon, and he is a trauma surgeon. So when there's trauma, he's putting all of these bones back together again. And of course, they can break and shatter in a lot of different ways. And he was doing something that they had never seen, the operating crew had never seen, the doctors that were with him had never seen, and even the technician who supplied the parts to the hardware to be able to help all this out, and he had been doing hardware for orthopedic surgeons for 20 years, saw him do something that no other surgeon, to our knowledge, has ever done before. My son had never seen anyone else do it at all either, but it was a complex situation, and he thought, and he realized, you know what, I can do it this way, kind of a reverse way, and be able to put that whole extremity and pelvis back together again, where it wouldn't have been able to be done otherwise. And afterwards, the technician wasn't even sure it was going to work. I've never seen a doctor do this before, and it worked beautifully well. And he says, wow, that's just amazing. Well, I can tell you, if he had had something to drink within the last 30 days, he wouldn't have done that. It would have been, well, I've never, I wouldn't even think about that side of things. And so that creativity aspect is extremely important. Nicotine also suppresses the frontal lobe of the brain more subtly than alcohol does, but it also is a frontal lobe suppressant. And the most commonly used substance that suppresses the frontal lobe throughout the world is caffeine. It ends with an INE because it is a drug. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain. And typists, for instance, can type a little bit faster under the influence of caffeine, but they make 10 times as many errors. And it can even affect our speech. Caffeine, of course, stimulates by getting rid of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, so it makes too much acetylcholine there and not enough adenosine activity, and that's why you have the frontal lobe suppression. And studies show that when you have caffeine on board, you're much more likely to gossip than when you don't have caffeine on board. Now, the definition of gossip is important to understand. It's not just saying something untrue. That's actually lying. It's more than just gossip. But gossip is sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. And studies show you're much more likely to do that, even with a friend of yours who is not present at the time, telling your other friends about some private information about this person who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. Of course, you end up regretting it down the road. And as this author said, when the stimulating influence is felt, their tongues are loosened. And so the frontal lobe is often a brake on human behavior, an appropriate brake. So we don't do things like that. But many people feel, all right, it's bad for some people, but for me, I can't function without it. I need that morning coffee, or I need that bowl, what do they call these? Red Bull. There's something else that's popular in America as well that is kind of 5 times as much caffeine as a Starbucks has. But it's highly stimulating. You're seeing a lot of these caffeine types of drinks. By the way, caffeine, it's one of those things that kills people every year. In America, there's something called caffeine powder. You can go to your convenience store, and if you're not sleeping or you think you're falling asleep at the wheel at midnight, you can buy this caffeine powder. But a lot of people are unaware that just 1 teaspoon of caffeine powder will kill them. It's 2,400 milligrams of caffeine. 2,400 milligrams of caffeine is a lethal dose, and you can't give them beta blockers. It won't slow it down. They're going to go into congestive heart failure. They're going to go into arrhythmias, and they will end up dying that night. And it's like, why do we allow a substance like that out there for people to be able to overdose and use that aren't even, really aware of what they're doing? But a lot of people think, well, 100 milligrams isn't going to kill me or anyone else. And for me, it's necessary for me to wake up. This was studied in a prospective placebo-controlled trial, and it showed although frequent consumers feel alerted by their caffeine, especially by their morning tea, coffee, or other caffeine-containing drink, evidence indicates that this is actually merely the reversal of the fatiguing effects of acute caffeine withdrawal. The reason why you feel like a zombie in the morning is because you're on caffeine regularly, and now you're undergoing withdrawal. And so the caffeine just reverses that withdrawal. Measurements showed that caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness are actually no higher than the non-caffeine consumers who received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to normal. In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine, as far as its energy and keeping you alert, are present virtually all day, only in those who don't consume it. And so if you really want to have that endurance and that focus all day, it's not going to be the ebbs and the drops of caffeine. It's going to be a non-caffeine user. Duke University did a study. I don't have the video connected to this. It was connected to another computer I had, but you can see it. It's actually, it wasn't Duke. It was Wake Forest. Wake Forest is another university in North Carolina, but this researcher from Wake Forest did a functional MRI, and he showed the blood flow of this ABC reporter who was doubting it. This ABC reporter loved her caffeine every morning, and so she took an MRI that morning, and then she had 1 cup of coffee and took another MRI. The circulation to her frontal lobe went down by 40%. And the typical person, it goes down about 28%, but it can be a range, and hers went down even more. And of course, there's no red, bells going off. Don't get into a conversation with your friend. You're going to gossip. Don't try to do a typing contest. You're going to make lots of mistakes. Because they don't necessarily feel very different. In fact, they tend to feel better with the stimulating effect. So carbs are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. Your brain, I think I mentioned it the other day, 2% of your body weight consumes 30% of your energy. And what produces the energy to be able to produce all those ATP molecules in the mitochondria, the primary source are carbs, and natural carbs. This is where your fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables are at. And as this one author say, they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. One of the advantages of a whole food, plant-based diet. Sugar, however, you would think it's a carb, so it should help, but sugar actually impairs frontal lobe functions in school-age children. And now we know in adults as well. What happens when we eat an ice cream sundae like that? Our blood sugar spikes, and 20 minutes afterwards, as it's up there super high, your pancreas thinks you've eaten a large amount of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. But you haven't. All you had was an ice cream sundae, so that blood sugar begins to plummet. And there's an overswing of insulin, and hypoglycemia occurs. You feel a little weak, a little shaky. Brain's not working all that well, and so you tend to snack again. But studies show it takes 4 hours after that hypoglycemia for your frontal lobe to fully recover from that. So it'll make a grade letter difference in performance in most subjects. Junk food diet linked to lower IQ as well. This was a study in children as well, controlled for known factors that affected IQ. 20% with the highest processed diet had a 5-point lower IQ compared with 20% who ate a more health-conscious diet with the most fruits, vegetables, salad, pasta, and rice. And the 1% of kids, this was looking at the 40 kids who were at the top 1%, as far as the most health-conscious diet, had a 15-point IQ advantage. So that's quite significant. By the way, speaking of, I don't think I have this slide, speaking of a plant-based diet, studies have shown if you have a high IQ at age 4 and 7, and even 10, if If your IQ is up at, in fact, it was done in 10-year-olds. 10-year-olds with the highest IQ had a very great chance of being a plant-based vegetarian by the time they were 30. And they were looking at that. Why is that the case? All these high IQ people are becoming plant-based at age 30. And then the study's author looked at with the definition of IQ. The definition of IQ is your capacity to do what? Learn, retain, and apply knowledge. So they realized these kids were more likely to learn about the positive effects of a plant-based diet. They're more likely to retain it, and they're more likely to do what? Apply it. And that's one of the reasons why high IQ people live longer, is because they're just applying their IQ. So there's times when I go out to eat with people that don't know me very well, and then they'll notice what I'm ordering, and then they'll ask, "Are you a vegetarian?" And I'll say, "Yes, I am." What's their next question? "Why are you a vegetarian?" If I don't have much time to spend with them, I'll just say, high IQ. Actually, I've been tempted to do that, but that would show low EQ, so I've never said that. All right, arachidonic acid. That's the pro-inflammatory mediator in meat and eggs. Arachidonic acid decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, has an adverse effect on the brain, and one of the reasons why a non-plant-based diet that's high in these things does not come out on top as far as IQ is concerned. Physical exercise will also help our brain circulation and frontal lobe circulation, and so we want to stay fit, but also very important. Oh, I thought I was going to have it in here. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, let me put these two in. We'll unhide it. Working with your hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. So working with your hands in 3D. Computer screens are all 2D. Now, you might fool yourself by putting on those new Apple glasses that you're working in 3D. It's not true. It looks like it's 3D. It's still 2 dimensions. And working with your hands in 3D is imperative. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And working with your hands in 3D in particular increases frontal lobe circulation. The back portion of your frontal lobe is where your hand motion is at. And as you're working with your hands in 3D, whether it's cooking, by the way, this plant-based cooking school, if you're able to actually do that yourself, you're going to improve your frontal lobe function. If you're gardening, that's going to improve frontal lobe function. And so working with your hands in 3 dimensions, even playing table tennis, I noticed that was one of the things you guys do here. That also enhances frontal lobe function, studies have shown. You're working with your hands in 3 dimensions. And this is something that I've recognized myself as important. Now, before I started doing administration at Weimar University, I used to be working with my hands a lot in 3 dimensions with gastroenterology procedures. And surgeons will also talk about how the clarity of working with their hands in 3D, it's why they like to work at 7:30 in the morning. It does something for their brain that's positive. And, but after, now I only do scopes, a couple of times a month, and maybe just 3 or 4 at a time. So it's not enough for me as far as working with my hands in 3D, and one of the reasons why I decided to build my own gyrocopter, where I have the time and the effort of working with my hands in 3 dimensions. Hypnosis. This comes from a hypnosis textbook that encourages its use. Hypnosis attempts to cancel out frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are what? Highly suggestible. So hypnosis, by definition, is going to cancel out frontal lobe functions. And it will tell you it's most easily accomplished by training the eyes to focus in on one object, the best object being a little flickering light. The person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, it's important that the hypnotist be in charge of the light, not you that's being hypnotized. But you might have a hypnotic instrument in your own home. What trains the eyes to focus in on what object and flickers? And what causes the flicker of television? It's the scene of reference change. I don't know, do you have these wealthy homes now, you know, they're putting theaters in them? Does that happen in Australia? Where you have this big theater room and you have this big screen. If you walk into one of those rooms near the front and you're not even looking at the screen, but you look at the faces of the people watching the movie, you will see the flash on their light, on their countenance, change an average of every 2 to 3 seconds. And sometimes it's simple, like they're coming up to a door, and then the camera view shows the hand knocking at the door. Then the camera switches 2 seconds later and it shows someone on the other side of the door coming to the door. Then it jumps over to another view of that door as it's being opened up. And if you were at that scene, you wouldn't be able to jump around in all of those places, but Hollywood Entertainment does that, so you'll keep your eyes focused on one object, and studies show after 90 seconds to 3 minutes, even if it's healthy programming, your frontal lobe will shut down. Your temporal lobe will still be going. You'll be able to remember it as a rerun. Your emotions, you can still laugh and cry with the scene, but you're no longer critically analyzing it. And they think one of the reasons why it happens is the brain cannot keep up with everything that's in those scene of reference things, because the frontal lobe takes time to be able to digest and analyze. And so when it's completely being bombarded every 2 or 3 seconds changing, the frontal lobe just gives up and says, I can't keep up with this, I'm going to sleep. And, but then you're still there having the adverse effects of this hypnosis. Studies have shown the more entertainment television, the more daydreaming. Daydreaming is not a good thing. Let me define it a little bit. Daydreaming is when you're in line at a grocery store and you see some Hollywood actor on the head of People, on the front page of People magazine. Maybe it's Brad Pitt or someone like that. And so you just tell yourself, as you know, waiting in line, that I'm going to be going home to my marriage partner, Brad Pitt. And your mind just starts going over in this fantasy land. This is actually not healthy for the brain. And studies have shown that you're more likely to experience dementia the more daydreaming you do. Also, when daydreaming goes up, another reason why it's unhealthy is creativity always goes down. So fantasy world is not improving your creativity. Decreases interest in reading. That's not a good thing. Decreases interest in learning. Also not a good thing. Reduces discernment. Trains you in non-reaction when you should be reacting. Increases aggressiveness when you shouldn't be reacting. It reduces your sensitivity to violence, and it's also addictive. The Detroit Free Press showed this very clearly. If you're on a steady diet of entertainment television and you stop watching television, you're going to have withdrawal headaches, you're going to have insomnia, you're going to have withdrawal symptoms. We used to run 5-day plans to stop smoking. I think it's good to run 5-day plans to stop watching television. People know it's not healthy for them. They don't know how to get away from it. The more TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop attention and learning problems, do poorly in school in the long run. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and even hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added 1 more daily hour of TV, you think, well, that's not bad, just 1 hour, doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. That is significant. And you know, there is some things we can do to stop this if we have kids. There was a person that's now famous that grew up not too far away from where I grew up. And we both had some things in common, even though we didn't know each other. One is my father raised me without any entertainment television. At the time, I thought it was child abuse. Because my kids would be talking, my friends would be talking about what's on TV, and I had no idea about it. Now, by age 15, I started recognizing this was actually pretty good. I wasn't raised on TV. I'm thinking of things and being able to solve things and do things that these other kids weren't able to do, and I recognized it was highly beneficial. But there was I think it was age 12, that this boy came home from school, and by the way, he was having significant problems in school. He was failing school. He was having emotional issues. He almost went to a juvenile jail as he tried to throw a knife at a kid. Fortunately, it hit his belt buckle instead of going into his abdomen. Having significant issues, and his mother, who was a single mom, refused to get on welfare, and so she worked 4 different jobs to support her 2 boys. And one of the jobs, she was working in wealthy homes, cleaning their houses, and she noticed something about the wealthy homes. No TV, and the kids were reading books. And they were reading educational books. Their parents would put educational books in front of them. And so she just made that connection, and so she went home and told her 2 sons, no more TV. You're going to check out 2 books from the Detroit Public Library, and you're going to write book reports about those 2 books, and if you do that before a week, then I'll let you watch some TV. And do you think their feelings of their mother went up or went down at that point? They started to complain about their mom. No, mom does this, you know, you're crazy, all these things, but she was serious. And they realized there was no TV, so they started checking books out of the Detroit Public Library. And without TV and reading educational books, their brains started to get a lot better. This boy went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class in 1 year. He said prior to that he hated poverty because he knew he was in the midst of poverty, but he said even though I was dirt poor, my hatred for poverty went away. He says, because I realized it was temporary now that I could make all these good grades. And he ended up getting into Yale and then University of Michigan for the School of Medicine, and he ended up being a neurosurgeon. And he also had no alcohol. He also did one other thing at the same time he gave up TV. He started listening to classical music that enhances the frontal lobe. And he began to do creative things that no one had ever thought possible in the operating room, separating Siamese twins and both of them surviving. No one had ever done that before. And you probably know, some of you know who I'm talking about. His name is Ben Carson. There's a book called Gifted Hands, and he was well liked by everyone in the United States until he got into politics. And I think he was bored after retiring from neurosurgery. But television takes away precious time for family, achievement, and spiritual pursuits as well. And that's the least it does as well, all of the time being wasted, plus the 17 areas that your frontal lobe goes down. Eric Braverman is a neuroscientist from New York. He says television does what to people? Mesmerizes them, turns them into intellectual spectators. It feeds passivity and makes you less engaged. Wheeler Dixon, professor of film studies, University of Nebraska, says TV also acts as a pacifier, a sort of virtual escape, but it is one that what? Never satisfies and only leaves the viewer wanting more of the same emptiness. Have you heard of binge watching? In regards to movies, this is where you're never being satisfied and wanting more of the same emptiness. But Braverman says reading is a much better substitute for your brain and creativity. The greatest thing, it stimulates both sides of the brain. This is when principles combined with illustration or stories to solidify the principles takes place. Alvin Toffler, he's a media expert that's written a lot of books about communication. He also was paid a lot of money to devise television commercials to separate people from their money who would watch them. But he stated this: constant stimulation of the senses shuts down the what? Analytical processes, and ultimately shuts down the ability to face life rationally. This leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of what kind of thinking? Disciplined thinking when you're faced with difficult duties and decisions. When do you need disciplined thinking? You need it when you are faced with difficult duties and decisions, but you will reject disciplined thinking at the time you very need it, when you are just constantly stimulating yourself. And it could be the rapid scene of reference change. Then you have MTV, where the syncopated metal or rock and roll music. Then you have sensual images on top of it with all of that going around. Powerful frontal lobe suppressant that's going to result in a lot of unwanted complications. So to take care of our frontal lobe, we must protect it from mechanical injury. This is one of the reasons why I can't watch these sports that have become popular, like these cage sports. What do they call it when you have two boxers in there? Well, it's not boxing, it's called, yeah, UFC. Studies show that if you get into a UFC fight, 1 out of 3 chance that one or both fighters within 15 minutes will have had a concussion. A concussion means that you've had microcirculation change in your brain. You're going to have all this inflammation. This is why I was very worried about that girl, Ronda Rousey. I don't know if you had heard of her, but she was winning all these events, and I knew her time was coming. And it came, and she was knocked out major, and she's not been the same girl since. It's not worth all the money in the world to have that happen to you. She got depressed, very suicidal. She did not want to live anymore. All of the microcirculation and inflammatory effects of that took hold. And then they manipulated her some more after she recovered enough to get back into the ring. And they say, we'll pay you this much if you get into the ring again. She got into the ring, and within 38 seconds, she was knocked out again. And all of that happened again. And it's just a sad situation that for the entertainment of humanity, you pay these people to destroy their brains. And we need to protect our brain from mechanical injury. That's one of the reasons why even the NFL is very questionable. I remember there was a quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys when they were winning championships. His name was Troy Aikman, and he was 32 years old, and no NFL team would hire him. And he was the most accurate passer in the league. He would stand on the goal line, 50 yards, that's 150 feet. I guess you know what 50 yards is, close to 50 meters. And so he had 10 mannequins there, and they all have numbers on their jerseys, and he threw 10 balls, and he hit everyone with the jersey when all the coaches were watching him. And still, no coach would hire him. Why wouldn't they hire him? Because the quarterback just doesn't throw passes. He has to make decisions. And he had had too many concussions, and he wasn't able to make the right decision with the ball, and so no team would hire him. We need to be careful and not really participate in sports where there's a high likelihood of brain injury. By the way, there was one UFC fighter. I haven't heard this happen before, but it was close by, and I heard one of our emergency room nurses used to go up, and it kind of tells you something when you have to have a whole ambulance waiting, at the sporting event. And so you have an ambulance with nurses there, all at the sporting event, in case this fighter needs to be rushed to the hospital afterwards. And they played championship night, and the UFC champion came forward, and there was a whole bunch of people following him to the hotel, all of these kids cheering and everything. When he got to the hotel and all of these kids cheering, he was on this elevated plank, and he leaned over at all of those kids and he says, "Quiet down, I want to tell you something." He said, don't do what I do. He said, it is very dangerous. He said, go to school, go to college, do well, and become creative, and you will not have to do what I do, because what I do is dangerous and it's not healthy. And all of them quit cheering, and they all went to bed just kind of in awe. Wow, I can't believe that guy actually said that. But very few of them will say that, even though they believe it. Supply it with good oxygen. How do we do that? Deep breathing, exercise, give it good nutrition. We talked some about that. We had a whole lecture on nutrition. Get adequate sunlight. That also helps serotonin. Just like a muscle, if we don't use our frontal lobe, we're going to lose our frontal lobe ability. We must exercise our frontal lobe. We must control the inputs over what we're seeing and hearing. And we must correct our distorted thoughts. Just the process of correcting distorted thoughts is healthy. By the way, another thing I have an issue with that's gaining in popularity is this idea of mindfulness meditation. Have you heard of that? A lot of people will say, okay, if drugs don't work, if counseling doesn't work, then you need to go to meditation and have this guru lead you through a meditative exercise. The characteristic of Eastern meditation is to be totally non-judgmental of what goes into your thoughts. And it sounds good on the surface. I'm going to be totally non-judgmental. But there was a randomized controlled trial, 5 of them actually, 5 randomized controlled trial done by an experienced meditator who had assumed that people's morality improved after Eastern meditation techniques, whether it's there's a whole bunch of different names for the same type of principle. It's kind of a form of self-hypnosis is what it is, so it's suppressing the frontal lobe. But she thought for sure morality would increase, and actually every randomized controlled trial, she kept having it larger and larger, because if it doesn't look like it's a good study, then you have to have more people involved. So after 5 randomized controlled trials, she was convinced. She said, meditation does not improve morality. Perhaps we should change and teach people to do meditation via an ethical construct. Well, if you're doing meditation via an ethical construct, it's no longer Eastern meditation. It's Western meditation. And that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is. It's listening to your thoughts and analyzing your thoughts. Analyzing your thoughts for what should be rejected. You're actually thinking about what's distorted, what's not helpful, and then changing those thoughts. That's the type of meditation that can be very healthy. And as we replace our unhelpful, distorted thoughts with helpful, distorted thoughts, it can make a big difference. I can show you those studies if you're interested afterwards. We have them here on the computer. And then prevent or control disease that affects it. That is, of course, also important, like hypertension and those sorts of things. As far as stimulating the frontal lobe, I can think of no better way than what the people in Acts did. Acts chapter 17, verse 11. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word, how? With all readiness of mind, and search the what? Scriptures, does it say weekly? Daily, whether those things were so. It was an analytical study of Scripture. And since the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, then why not read the most popular spiritual book and analyze it, and it can greatly help your frontal lobe. Back to Braverman, he says, happiness comes from the interaction between inspiration and perspiration. That's probably worth remembering. People are searching for happiness, but it comes from the interaction between what? Inspiration and perspiration. Anything that stops humans from perspiring to achieve something inspiring gives a what? A false fantasy and an endless distraction from reaching your full potential. My goal is for each one of you that have attended this seminar for you to reach your full potential and experience that happiness that can only come from the interaction between inspiration and perspiration. You've had a lot of seminars where you're learning information, so you might have gotten inspired on some things here, but it's not going to help unless you leave this seminar and begin to perspire in the areas that you've been inspired. And perspiration plus the inspiration can produce wonderful and will produce wonderful results. My last text, wisdom is better than rubies. Wisdom means your frontal lobe is fully intact. You have that critical thinking ability. You have that creativity. And Solomon had the rubies, but he recognized there was something better, and that's wisdom. He even went so far to say, all the things that may be desired, it may not be rubies you desire, it may be this, it might be that. Whatever you might be desiring, it's still not in proportion unless you put wisdom up there first. All the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it, meaning wisdom. So my encouragement from you going forward is to enhance the frontal lobe of your brain, become wise human beings, and use all of the tools necessary, the physical things like good nutrition and healthy exercise and outdoor activity, along with the emotional and mental things like correcting your distorted thoughts and in creating new pathways of helpful thoughts, and you will not only help any depression, anxiety, or mental illness, but you will achieve the highest levels of both IQ and EQ for you. I mentioned I would open it up for questions, but before I do that, I think there might be an announcement. No questions? Okay. So, any questions? Yes. There might be a microphone coming your way. Yes, there it is. Thank you.
There's so many studies out now that people are quoting to me about caffeine and coffee and how the antioxidants are in it and it's improving people's abilities to perform and protectors for your heart and all that sort of stuff. Can you?
Okay, so caffeine is one of those things. Caffeine only has risks, but caffeine we get from natural products like coffee beans. And beans are legumes, and they have some antioxidants in them. But there are other legumes that are even higher in antioxidants than the coffee legume. And you don't hear any of these people promoting the use of those legumes to get higher antioxidants. And so once again, it's the narrowed human approach of looking at benefits and risks and saying there are benefits of coffee. Yes, there are. There are antioxidant benefits of those legumes. But why subject yourself to the risk? Why not just eat legumes that don't have any caffeine? Yes.
One, too much cigarettes, that's my problem, I have to give up. Well, my first language was not English. I come from Portugal, but I done nearly full high school in Portugal, studying English. I can speak 4 languages fluent, but my English was not the first language. I still need to improve my English. My question is that, what about yoga? I remember a long time ago, I had the book and I just done one exercise and it really works on me. So it's a good idea, example, buy a good book and follow the exercise for being more, meant for health, mental health or whatever, What is your opinion?
Well, my opinion is the stretching and the exercise and those sorts of things are going to be good. But yoga, as you reach the higher levels, it's one of those forms of Eastern meditation, and it's very clear that that's where it leads to. And so when you take a look at the whole system as an approach, I would take opposition to that personally because of the systematic approach. To me, it's kind of like maybe not quite on the same level, but maybe, you know, if we have, you know, a Nazi flag and say Heil Hitler at an exercise session for Germans coming, you know, I can agree with all the exercise that they're doing, but I wouldn't support that systematic construct because of what it's leading to. And so I want you to be able to utilize your frontal lobe and not get into things where we are putting the frontal lobe at rest, which is essentially the core of hypnosis and Eastern meditation philosophy. Yes, back in the very back. Yeah.
I don't know if my question relates to this, but it did come to my mind when I was in 5th grade. I'm not good in maths, but one time the teacher said, how many thousands are there in a million? And I was the first one to put my hand up. 1,000 thousands make a million, with the comprehending the number too. What could that be, you know? But I'm a C in maths, I'm C. But others knew it, but it came later, for example.
Well, just a reminder, Einstein in the 3rd grade was sent home and said never to come back to school again, that he was not going to be successful. And his teacher said maybe he'll be able to be a janitor somewhere, but you're not going to be able to get this guy to do anything academically. Fortunately, his mother started giving him violin lessons. And Einstein began to improvise on the violin, and when he did so, that frontal lobe really started to come back and started working significantly. And even when he ran into problems as an adult, he'd say, when I run into something where I'm stuck, I go into my other room and I pick up the violin and I begin to improvise. And so in his instance, healthy music helped a great deal. And just because you were getting a C in math but could understand that aspect of things might mean that, you know, I mean, I would say it certainly meant that you had some frontal lobe there and you were figuring things out, even though you might not have known your multiplication tables as well as a classmate next to you. All right, question right there, and then we'll need to get on this side as well.
I've got a question, because you're talking about the impact of television, and what about the impact of the screen with the kids nowadays? Because, you know, after pandemic, the kids has to study at home, and even in school, they're being exposed to a lot of screen, even when they're still really young. So that's my first question. And second question, related to this morning session about self-control. When is the right age to teach self-control to the kids? Because, you know, sometimes they say it's like, oh, they're just a little young. Let them be naughty a little bit, kind of thing. So when is the right timing for us to basically talking about self-control with our kids?
So, yeah, 2 questions. The self-control one with the kids, it's never too early. Studies show you can teach self-control even by age 6. And so certainly by age 6, that's when kind of the age of accountability comes and they can start managing themselves more. But leading up to that, there are a lot of things that you can do, like keeping them away from screens, keeping them away from things that produce dopamine surges for them that are going to be significantly advantageous. And then the question in regards to academics and screens, I can show you a lot of data that the Google CEOs, even Steve Jobs, a lot of these computer gurus are mandating their own kids go to a school where there are no screens. And they are very aware of the adverse effects of screens on kids. These people do not allow their own kids to have unlimited access to screens at all. So there are many schools starting to crop up that are schools where you use books and you use hands-on learning. And that still trumps the use of screens. Now, down the road, we can teach them computerized things, particularly computer programming. There's a book that's probably well worth reading. I don't know if it's made it here to Australia. It's called Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. Cal Newport is a very famous computer programmer in the US. He refuses to work over 40 hours a week, and he makes $1 million a year programming computers. And how he got so smart in programming computers was by not utilizing them growing up. And so he refused to get on social media. He tells a story. He refused to get on the internet. He refused to even market himself on computers. He says, if you're very good at something, people will find you. And so he's written a book called Digital Minimalism, and he says before we do anything on a computer or download an app, we should ask ourselves a question. And he says it should be very much like the Amish. Do they have Amish in Australia? Probably not. Okay, there's a group in the east over by Pennsylvania that are called the Amish. They have a religion where they restrict technology. And so, if a technological advancement comes forward, they have a patriarch in their group that discusses it with the rest of the group, and then he's going to ask questions. Is this going to take away time for family? Is it going to take away time for spiritual pursuits? Is it going to take away time for work? Is it going to take a time away for advancement? And if it does that, then is it worth it for the benefit that's there? So they weigh the benefits versus the risks, and so they decline most of the technological advances that come out because they don't think it's worth that. And he says we should do that before we download any app, before we actually get on a computer. Where is this heading me towards? And so he's not a fan of, Cal Newport's not a fan of YouTube or those type of things because we waste a lot of time and suppress a lot of our frontal lobes that way. So we shouldn't even necessarily have it accessible. So he talks about using our digital media smartly, but if we're using it smartly, it should be less than 1 hour a day max for all of us, and it should be very intelligently used. Now, if you're going to use it to find the Dundas Church on your GPS, I think that's good because you're not going to get lost in that app. I don't see people sitting here trying to find out alternate routes that they could have used trying to get here. If you were doing that and getting addicted to all that, then it's probably not worth it. But if you can find the shortest route and come here, then that's a good use of an app, and you're not going to have problems that way. And so that's how we should be looking at those devices. All right, I think there's some questions on this side.
And they are soccer players. I'm very concerned with head concussion.
So I didn't know that question was going to come up in Australia because I think that's a very popular sport, right? Do you call it soccer here? Okay, so you use the English term for it, I guess. I know most of the world calls it football. The issue with soccer, there's one primary issue that I don't like about it, and that is that ball is coming at you 50 miles an hour, and you're going to headbutt it. And the headbutts do produce some microcirculation changes. So there are some adverse changes to the brain with this headbutting rule. The other reason why I'm not a super fan of soccer is because there's rules that you cannot use your hands unless you're the goalie. So if you're going to play soccer, I would recommend you be a goalie and get some frontal lobe enhancement when you're out there and utilize your hands in 3D. Be aware of the headbutting aspect of things in regards to the ball. Yes. Yeah, we can. Okay, on this side, over here.
Thank you, Doctor. How antidepressant affects the frontal lobe, please?
Antidepressants, how do they affect the frontal lobe? Well, it depends on the antidepressant. If you do have a serotonin shortage and you're using an SSRI, it can actually enhance the frontal lobe in certain ways. So serotonin is a frontal lobe enhancer. That's why we talked about sunlight, good nutrition, those sorts of things. But it's a selective frontal lobe enhancer. For instance, the SSRIs, the antidepressants, actually worsen impulsivity. Impulsivity is against the frontal lobe because the frontal lobe is going to help us not to be impulsive. So it doesn't help the frontal lobe in that area, and that's why it has the big black box warning for suicides, because suicide is often an impulsive act. But it does enhance the frontal lobe in other areas. What I would recommend, if you're on an SSRI, is try to get on the right diet, right exercise, even the right supplements, and get your own neurons to make enough serotonin so you don't have to plug the vacuum cleaners in the receptor neurons. And then chances are you're going to be able to get off that antidepressant in 16 or 20 weeks. So that would be a good goal. Yes, and we'll take, okay, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I've got two questions. One is when you were explaining a couple of nights ago about the ratio of tryptophan, why is the importance of emphasizing on the ratio? And then my second question is how there's a lot of things out there like ADHD, like healing the gut, issues we've related to autoimmune that obviously affect depression and anxiety. I'm just wondering, for someone that is on this journey and trying to figure out what their issues are, how would you, like, I know that you have a clinic in the US, but for someone in Australia, how would they go about to discover what's wrong with them?
Okay, so from the first question, tryptophan versus the ratio of the other large neutral amino acids. The reason why we look at that ratio is all 6 of those amino acids use the same carrier to cross the blood-brain barrier. And tryptophan is the least abundant of all of them. And that's what we need to make serotonin. So we want to have ratios that are better with tryptophan compared to those 5. And we also, this is why we want to be on an exercise plan, because if we're on an exercise plan, those other large neutral amino acids go to the muscles and allow a better ratio of tryptophan to get into the brain. And so that's why it's important to look at those ratios, because it's not just the tryptophan content, it's the tryptophan compared to that ratio, and also carbohydrate content, which even makes it a little more complex. If we have more carbs with it, we also get more tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier. The second question is in regards to GI health and autoimmune disease. There are some things that increase autoimmune disease, like loosening the tight junctions in the GI tract with high spicy food, et cetera, which loosens those tight junctions and allows the large molecules to come in. That can also cause issues with the brain as well, particularly if we have an inflamed brain. If we don't have an inflamed brain, those large molecules aren't going to cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's only the small molecules that get across. And so, of course, it depends on, the GI condition, the autoimmune disease, as far as what we would recommend. And one of the things that's critically important, even maybe more important than those tight junctions, is our microbiome. We had an expert in the microbiome come to our last EQ Summit. You might want to see his recordings in regards to the commensurate relationship we have between the healthy bacteria in our gut and our brain. And it's pretty amazing. If we have good gut bacteria, we're going to make more serotonin in the brain. It's that simple. And of course, the gut bacteria can also help us with nutrients to make more serotonin, like B12, the only nutrient that's absorbed right next to that microbiome in the lowest part of the small intestine. And so there's a number of things there that we can do or recommend to help fix the microbiome, but mostly it's a plant-based diet that comes out on top again, because that's the prebiotics. When we have good fiber and good prebiotics, we have a healthy microbiome, which can also help our brain. As far as where to get all of this in Australia versus our clinic, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to work, if at all possible, to see if there's a potential for a residential program where we can leave no stone unturned and look at all of those things here without you having to fly to the US but you're still able to fly to the U.S. for now until we get that established. So I would encourage you, if you need the help, come to where you can get it. All right, we'll take maybe 2 questions left, one here and then one over there, and then we'll need to wrap things up.
So learning through podcasts and YouTube compared to reading a book, effect on the frontal lobe, and are there any research on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There can be educational programming on YouTube. Here's kind of the interesting thing. If your YouTube lecture is a very good YouTube lecture and it's 58 minutes, then you're okay. Because that requires prolonged focus and it's going to be good for your frontal lobe. But then we have people that are addicted to these 1-minute videos. And they're fast and they're whatever, and they're going from one to the other. Their retention rate is not good. They're not able to sort it all together, and it's not near as healthy. But your typical young person, if they look at a 58-minute video, even though it's going to be something they're very interested in, it's like, I don't have the focus. There's no way I'm going to click on that. 58 minutes, not capable. Well, the problem is they're also not capable of managing their emotions, because studies show if you can't focus, you're not going to be able to manage distressing emotions. So you need to actually work on improving your ability to focus to be able to start managing your emotions successfully. So I'm not out here to condemn YouTube and all of its forms. I mean, these videos here might end up on YouTube for 3 months, but they're not just 1-minute video YouTubes. They're looking at the whole focus and comprehension aspect. Yes?
How do you do that? What exercise?
Yes, exercising the frontal lobe is doing anything that helps stimulate your analytical ability or your spiritual life. So the spiritual and analytical portion of the brain can be stimulated by even, participating in exercises like Bible study. I think there's a Bible study coming up on the area of forgiveness next weekend. And that's a crucial study, actually, because forgiveness is not just for us, but what about others? Are we going to forgive others? Or under what conditions might we forgive others? Those sorts of things are spiritual exercises where we can look at stories and spiritual themes together. It's a good frontal lobe stimulation. And even studying the book of Daniel has been shown to be very healthy. In fact, we do a follow-up study for the 8-week program sometimes on the book of Daniel. And those stories have great mental health applications, and they also really help in regards to the frontal lobe enhancement when we start analyzing them in a method that makes it practical and very useful for all of us. Well, you've been a very attentive group.